Alright, hello fellow sapiens. Since you clicked the age of change, you're probably feeling that quiet tension between wanting things to stay the same and knowing they never do. So sit back, or lie down and relax. Tonight, this is not motivation, and it's not advice. It's a slow walk through deep time, through archaeology, paleoclimate, and the long evidence of how humans learn to live in a world that refused to stand still. This is Sleepless Homo. We do soft science and slow storytelling here. No shouting, no certainty where none exists. Just careful facts, humble questions, and the long view of our species, told gently, like breath beside firelight. Now imagine this. A world where the ground beneath your feet does not stay the same long enough to be trusted. Rivers appear where dust once ruled, then vanish again within a few generations. Grasslands stretch outward, inviting movement and abundance, only to fracture into scrub and silence as rains withdraw. Lakes fill, overflow, then retreat into salt flats and memory. What if the most dangerous illusion early humans faced was not hunger, or predators, or cold, but the belief that any of this stability might last? We do not know for certain what the first members of our species felt as they moved through these landscapes, but the evidence suggests that the environments in which early Homo sapiens emerged were among the most unstable on Earth. This was not a gentle background of slow change unfolding over tens of thousands of years in one direction. It was a world of oscillation, reversal, and interruption. The Middle and Late Pleistocene in Africa were marked by repeated and often abrupt climatic swings, driven by shifts in Earth's orbit, monsoon systems, and ocean circulation. Wet phases expanded lakes and rivers across regions that are now desert. Arid phases followed, sometimes within a few human lifetimes, collapsing those same water systems and breaking continuous habitats into scattered ecological islands. For a species just beginning to consolidate its anatomical and behavioural form, this instability was not a passing challenge. It was the setting in which everything else had to function. The record of this instability is written not in stories, but in sediment. Lake beds across East Africa, from the Rift Valley to the Horn, preserve layered histories of water and absence. Fine-grained clays indicate deep, persistent lakes formed during humid phases. Overlying them, coarse sands and evaporate deposits mark intervals of drying and retreat. Pollen cores extracted from these sediments tell the same story from another angle. Grasses replace trees, then trees return. Woodlands fragment into savanna mosaics, then reconnect. These shifts are not gradual slopes, but sharp steps, sometimes unfolding over centuries rather than millennia. For early human populations, this meant that the ecological rules governing food, shelter, and movement were repeatedly rewritten within the span of cultural memory. Habitat fragmentation followed naturally from these oscillations. During wetter periods, expansive corridors of grassland and woodland allowed animals and humans to move across large regions with relative continuity. During arid phases, those corridors collapsed. Productive zones shrank into refugia clustered around remaining water sources, upland regions, or coastal margins. The spaces between became barriers of heat, dust, and scarcity. This did not simply reduce the amount of livable land, it changed its geometry. Instead of broad, connected worlds, early humans inhabited patchworks that expanded and contracted unpredictably. A valley that supported life in one generation might become impassable in the next. A route remembered by elders might no longer exist for their grandchildren. Archaeological evidence mirrors this pattern of instability. Occupation sites from the Middle Stone Age often appear as brief pulses rather than continuous records. Layers of human activity are interspersed with long gaps where no trace remains, not because humans vanished entirely, but because the places they once used were no longer viable. In some regions, tool traditions appear, disappear, and reappear with subtle variations, suggesting repeated movements into and out of landscapes as conditions allowed. The same valleys and lake margins were revisited across thousands of years, but never occupied continuously. These were not permanent homes. They were opportunities taken when the environment permitted and abandoned when it did not. What emerges from this record is not a picture of early humans clinging stubbornly to familiar ground, but one of constant recalibration. Environmental unpredictability acted as a selective pressure, not by favouring strength or endurance alone, but by rewarding flexibility. Those populations able to shift their ranges, adjust their foraging strategies, and reorganize their movements in response to changing conditions were more likely to persist. This did not mean constant wandering without pattern. It meant learning how to read landscapes that refused to remain legible for long. Knowledge had to be provisional. Routes had to be remembered, but never assumed. Places had to be valued, but never depended upon absolutely. The illusion of permanence in such a world would have been costly. To invest too heavily in a single location, a single resource base, or a single way of living was to risk collapse when the environment turned. The land itself imposed this lesson repeatedly. Each wet phase tempted stability, encouraging longer stays and denser use of resources. Each dry phase withdrew that promise, forcing dispersal, innovation, or retreat. Over time, the pattern became clear, not as an abstract understanding, but as a lived reality reinforced by loss and survival. The ground would not stay still. Any strategy built on the hope that it might was fragile. This instability also shaped how early humans related to time. In environments where conditions oscillated rapidly, long-term prediction was limited. Planning had to be short enough to remain relevant, yet flexible enough to adapt when expectations failed. This favoured attentiveness over certainty. Rather than optimizing life for a single anticipated future, early humans appear to have maintained a readiness for multiple possible outcomes. Archaeological assemblages show a reliance on diverse resources rather than narrow specialization, even when particular prey or plants were temporarily abundant. Diversity functioned as insurance against the next environmental reversal. Importantly, this was not a world in which change was rare or exceptional. It was constant enough to be expected, but irregular enough to remain dangerous. That combination matters. A steadily worsening climate might allow gradual adaptation. A completely random environment would be impossible to navigate. The Pleistocene oscillations fell between these extremes. They were patterned but not predictable in detail. Early humans lived inside that tension. The landscape taught them that movement was not failure, and that adaptation was not optional. It was the price of remaining alive. From this perspective, change was not experienced as an interruption to normal life. It was the background against which life was organized. Normality itself was provisional. The repeated loss and reappearance of viable living zones ensured that no generation could assume continuity. Each cohort inherited not a stable world, but a set of expectations shaped by stories of previous shifts. Memory became layered with absence. Places were known not only for what they were, but for what they had once been and might become again. This constant environmental pressure did not produce a single solution. It produced a disposition, a way of being oriented toward the world that assumed alteration rather than continuity. The archaeological record does not show early humans mastering their environment in the sense of controlling it. It shows them learning how to remain legible within it. They adjusted their movements, technologies, and social arrangements to a world that refused to stabilize long enough to be dominated. Change was not a problem to be solved. It was a condition to be navigated again and again. Seen this way, the fear associated with change in human experience takes on a different meaning. It was not fear of novelty alone, but fear born from the real risks that accompanied environmental shifts. When rains failed or roots collapsed, the consequences were immediate and severe. Caution was adaptive, hesitation had value. Yet alongside that caution, there was an equally strong pressure to move when movement became necessary. Survival lay not in resisting change, but in responding to it without illusion. The deep past offers no image of a stable beginning from which humans later fell into chaos. Instead, it presents a long initiation into instability itself. Early Homo sapiens did not emerge into a balanced world that later became hostile. They emerged into fluctuation, fragmentation, and uncertainty. The skills that carried them forward were forged under those conditions. Change was not something that happened to them. It was something they were shaped within. Change, then, was not an interruption to early human life. It was the condition under which life was possible at all. Long before memory could hold a sense of permanence, the land itself taught movement. If this kind of calm, factual exploration helps you think, or sleep, consider liking the episode and subscribing. It quietly helps other sleepless minds find their way here too. And tell me in the comments, how are you listening right now? Before sleep, while working, or with headphones on somewhere quiet? If you drift off, don't worry. Timestamps are waiting when you return. All right, let's continue. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Picture a moment when a place that once sustained you begins to fail, not suddenly, not violently, but quietly. The water still comes, though less reliably. The animals still pass through, though not as often. The familiar paths still exist, but they no longer lead where they once did. How do you learn to walk away from a place that once fed you? Not because it has collapsed, but because it is no longer enough. We do not know for certain how early humans recognized the moment when a landscape had reached this threshold, but the archaeological record suggests that they did so repeatedly and deliberately. Across East and Southern Africa, sites attributed to the Middle Stone Age reveal occupation layers that are thin, intermittent and carefully bounded. These are not the deep accumulations of debris that signal long-term settlement. Instead, they appear as brief pulses of activity, often separated by long intervals of absence. Hearths are shallow. Tool scatters are sparse. There is little evidence of architectural investment or extensive modification of the ground. These places were used, left, and sometimes used again, but rarely held continuously. The pattern speaks not of collapse, but of choice. At many of these sites, the material traces suggest short stays rather than permanent residence. Camps were established quickly and dismantled just as efficiently. Fire was made, food was processed, tools were repaired or discarded, and then the place was allowed to fall back into silence. There are few signs of accumulation that would indicate an expectation of return within the same season, let alone across generations. Instead, the archaeological signal aligns with mobility as a planned strategy. Early humans appear to have treated landscapes as sequences of opportunities rather than as fixed homes. A valley, a lake shore, a woodland edge could be productive for a time, but it was never assumed to be so indefinitely. This interpretation is reinforced by the nature of the toolkits found at these sites. Stone tools from many Middle Stone Age contexts show an emphasis on portability and versatility. Raw materials were often sourced locally, suggesting that tools were made with the expectation that they might be used briefly and then abandoned. At the same time, certain tool types were designed to be carried, repaired, and reused across different locations. This combination indicates a flexible approach to material culture. Tools were neither hoarded nor monumental. They were calibrated to a way of life in which movement was normal and leaving was anticipated. Permanence was not built into the objects that mediated survival. Evidence for planned mobility also appears in the spatial arrangement of sites themselves. Archaeologists have identified patterns of occupation that suggest seasonal circuits rather than random wandering. Certain locations were revisited under similar environmental conditions, implying that groups retained a knowledge of when and how these places could be used effectively. A lakeshore might be occupied during a wet phase, then left as water levels dropped, only to be returned to generations later when conditions again allowed. These were not fixed homelands in the modern sense. They were nodes in a shifting network, activated when the landscape permitted and abandoned without sentiment when it did not. Importantly, these departures do not carry the archaeological signature of panic or desperation. There is little evidence of sudden resource exhaustion, mass mortality, or catastrophic failure at most of these sites. Instead, the record suggests that early humans often left before conditions became untenable. This implies an ability to read subtle environmental cues and to act on them in advance. Declining water quality, changes in vegetation, shifts in animal movement, all would have signalled that a place was approaching the edge of its usefulness. To remain too long would have been to gamble against an increasingly unfavourable future. Leaving early preserved options, this capacity to leave without collapse required a particular relationship to place. Early humans do not appear to have defined themselves through exclusive attachment to specific locations. There is little evidence of long-term territorial markers or of efforts to defend or modify landscapes in ways that would anchor identity to geography. Instead, belonging seems to have been oriented more toward people than toward land. Social groups moved together, carrying their knowledge, skills, and relationships with them. Place was important, but it was not absolute. It was one factor among many in a constantly recalculated equation of survival. Seasonal return routes further complicate any notion of abandonment as failure. Leaving a place did not necessarily mean severing all connection to it. Many sites show evidence of repeated use across long spans of time, but only under specific conditions. These patterns suggest that early humans maintained mental maps of landscapes that extended far beyond their immediate surroundings. They remembered where resources could be found and under what circumstances. They also remembered when not to return. Knowledge of absence was as valuable as knowledge of presence. To know that a place would not sustain you at a given time was to avoid costly mistakes. From this perspective, abandonment becomes a form of skill. It required restraint, coordination, and trust within the group. Leaving meant relinquishing familiarity in favour of uncertainty elsewhere. It meant carrying fewer possessions and accepting the risks of travel. Yet it also meant preserving life by avoiding overcommitment to a single patch of land. The archaeological record suggests that early humans learned this balance early and practiced it often. They did not cling to places until they were forced out. They left while leaving was still possible. This pattern challenges modern intuitions about home and success. In many contemporary narratives, staying is equated with stability and progress, while leaving is framed as loss or defeat. The deep past offers a different lesson. For early Homo sapiens, the ability to walk away from a place that had once provided was not a sign of failure. It was evidence of awareness. It reflected an understanding that landscapes have life cycles, and that survival depends on recognizing when those cycles are turning. There is a quiet discipline in this way of living. It requires accepting that no place owes you continuity. It requires recognizing that gratitude for what a landscape has given does not obligate you to remain when it can no longer give. Early humans appear to have practiced this discipline repeatedly, guided by experience rather than ideology. Their movements were not aimless, but neither were they anchored. They followed rhythms that emerged from the land itself, adjusting their presence to match its capacity. Over time, this practice of leaving shaped not only patterns of movement, but ways of thinking. To inhabit a world where departure is normal is to internalize impermanence at a practical level. Places become chapters rather than conclusions. The end of one occupation is not an ending, but a transition to another possibility. In this sense, early humans learned to read landscapes as temporary partners rather than permanent foundations. Early humans didn't cling to places, they learned when to let them go. Leaving did not mean failure, it meant survival recalibrated. You spend hours shaping stone with care and skill, knowing that you may never carry the finished tool very far, and that you may leave it behind before the day is over. Why would a species invest time, attention, and learning into tools meant to be abandoned? Not preserved, not inherited, not even remembered by name. We do not know for certain how early humans thought about their tools in abstract terms, but the archaeological record suggests a relationship to technology that was fundamentally different from our own. Across vast stretches of prehistory, stone tool technologies favoured flexibility over specialisation. Instead of highly specific implements designed for narrow tasks, early Homo sapiens and their close ancestors relied on multi-purpose forms that could be adapted quickly to changing circumstances. These tools were not expressions of permanence, they were expressions of readiness. Their value lay not in durability alone, but in their ability to remain useful as conditions shifted around them. In many Middle Stone Age assemblages, archaeologists find tool types that appear again and again across different regions, often separated by great distances and long spans of time. Similar forms emerge independently in East Africa, Southern Africa, and parts of North Africa, not because of direct cultural transmission alone, but because they solved recurring problems under similar constraints. A simple flake with a sharp edge can cut meat, scrape hide, shape wood, or process plants. A core prepared in a particular way can generate multiple usable edges with minimal effort. These designs did not lock their users into a single way of interacting with the environment. They allowed adjustment. When prey species changed, when vegetation shifted, when terrain became more open or more enclosed, the same basic tools could be repurposed without requiring an entirely new technological system. This pattern of recurrent reinvention is striking. Instead of a linear progression toward ever more specialized or complex tools, the archaeological record shows cycles of innovation that converge on similar solutions. Prepared core technologies appear, disappear, and reappear in different contexts. Hefting techniques develop in multiple places, often using different materials but similar principles. The emphasis is not on maintaining a fixed tradition at all costs, but on rediscovering what works under particular environmental pressures. This suggests that early human technological knowledge was not rigidly conserved, but dynamically reconstructed. Skills were learned, adapted, and sometimes lost, only to be relearned when conditions demanded them again. The materials used for these tools reinforce this interpretation. In many regions, stone was sourced locally rather than transported over long distances. This indicates that early humans did not always rely on established extraction sites or long-term supply networks. Instead, they made use of what was immediately available, adjusting their techniques to the quality and type of stone at hand. A group moving into a new area did not require access to a specific quarry to function effectively. They required knowledge of how to read stone, how to strike it, and how to accept variation in outcome. This flexibility reduced dependence on any single location or resource and made movement less costly. Tool traditions also adapted in response to shifting prey and terrain. In more open environments, tools suited for processing large game or working wood might dominate. In more wooded or resource-diverse landscapes, smaller, more versatile implements appear. These shifts do not necessarily represent sudden cultural revolutions. They reflect incremental adjustments made by people responding to immediate challenges. The same population could modify its tool use across generations without abandoning the underlying principles that guided production. Technology, in this sense, functioned as a responsive interface between humans and their environment, not as a rigid blueprint imposed upon it. One of the most telling aspects of these tool assemblages is the evidence for rapid learning rather than strict transmission. Variation within sites and across short time spans suggest that individuals experimented with techniques and adjusted them based on results. There is less indication of standardized forms enforced across entire regions for long periods. Instead, we see families of tools that share broad characteristics but differ in detail. This implies that knowledge was transmitted through practice and observation, rather than through formalized instruction aimed at exact replication. Learning was adaptive. It allowed for mistakes, improvisation, and local solutions. From this perspective, abandonment takes on a new meaning. Leaving a tool behind did not represent a loss equivalent to abandoning a modern manufactured object. The knowledge required to make another tool travelled with the group. Stone was plentiful in many environments, and the skills to shape it were embodied rather than externalized. A tool was a temporary extension of those skills, not a permanent repository of value. This reduced the psychological and practical cost of movement. When a group left a campsite, they did not leave behind their technology. They carried it in their hands and minds. This approach to technology aligns closely with the broader patterns of mobility seen in early human archaeology. Just as camps were temporary and landscapes were treated as episodic resources, tools were designed for a life in motion. They were light, adaptable, and easily replaced. There was little incentive to invest in heavy, fixed infrastructure or highly specialized equipment that would tether a group to a particular place. The technological system itself encouraged departure when departure became necessary. Importantly, this does not mean that early human technology was simple or unsophisticated. On the contrary, producing effective multi-purpose tools requires a deep understanding of materials, force and geometry. It requires anticipation of future needs, without precise knowledge of what those needs will be. This kind of foresight is subtle. It does not aim to control the future, but to remain functional within it. The sophistication lies in restraint. Instead of building tools that solve one problem perfectly, early humans built tools that could solve many problems adequately. Over time, this technological philosophy shaped how humans interacted with change itself. Tools became mediators of uncertainty. They allowed people to enter unfamiliar environments without being helpless. They reduced the risk associated with exploration and movement, yet they also avoided locking their users into a narrow range of behaviours. In a world where conditions could reverse within a few generations, this balance mattered. A specialised tool might offer short-term efficiency, but it could become useless if circumstances shifted. A flexible tool traded some efficiency for resilience. The archaeological record suggests that early humans learned this trade-off well. They did not pursue mastery in the sense of domination or permanence. They pursued usability under fluctuation. Their tools reflect an acceptance of impermanence built into material form. To make something that you expect to abandon is to acknowledge that the future cannot be fully secured. It is a quiet admission of uncertainty and a practical response to it. Seen in this light, early human technology was not about imposing order on a chaotic world. It was about staying legible within it. Tools were shaped to remain relevant across changing prey, shifting climates, and unfamiliar terrain. They carried forward only what was necessary and let the rest fall away. This approach allowed humans to move without technological collapse, to adapt without constant reinvention of entire systems, and to survive without anchoring themselves too tightly to any single solution. Human technology evolved not to master environments, but to stay useful as they transformed. Objects carried forward only what could survive uncertainty. Picture a moment when staying feels safer than leaving, when the ground beneath you still produces food, when familiar animals still pass nearby, when the rhythms you have learned have not yet failed. Why, in such a moment, would stillness become more dangerous than movement? We do not know for certain when early humans first encountered the full cost of staying put, but the evidence suggests that this lesson emerged repeatedly and harshly across the Pleistocene world. As climates oscillated and environments restructured, animal populations did not simply decline in place. They moved, fragmented, or vanished altogether. Megafaunal species expanded their ranges during favourable periods, then contracted or disappeared when conditions shifted. These changes often unfolded over timescales short enough to disrupt human lifeways within a few generations. For groups whose survival depended on predictable access to particular animals or plants, these shifts carried immediate consequences. The archaeological and paleontological record preserve traces of this instability through patterns of faunal turnover. In many regions, the species present in one period are replaced by different assemblages in the next, reflecting changes in temperature, rainfall, and vegetation. Large-bodied animals, especially those adapted to specific ecological niches, prove particularly vulnerable. As grasslands shrank or forests advanced, their ranges fragmented. Some populations retreated to refugia, others declined beyond recovery. Humans who had come to rely heavily on such prey faced a narrowing window of opportunity. The disappearance of a favoured species did not simply remove one food source, it destabilised entire subsistence strategies built around its presence. Changing prey availability amplified these pressures. In environments where animal populations fluctuated rapidly, hunting strategies that worked well for decades could become ineffective within a single lifetime. Herds altered migration routes. Breeding cycles shifted. Some species became more elusive or less abundant, while others moved into newly favourable zones. For human groups anchored to particular hunting grounds, this volatility posed a dilemma. To remain was to risk increasing returns on effort, spending more time and energy for diminishing reward. To move was to confront uncertainty elsewhere. The archaeological record suggests that groups who chose stillness too long paid a higher price. Overdependence on single resources emerges as a recurring vulnerability in this context. Sites associated with narrow subsistence strategies often show signs of abrupt abandonment or decline coinciding with environmental change. When a group structured its movements, tools, and social organisation around a limited set of resources, it reduced its capacity to respond when those resources failed. This does not imply ignorance or poor judgment. Specialisation can be highly effective under stable conditions, but in a world defined by oscillation, specialisation increased exposure to risk. The very efficiency that made a strategy successful also made it fragile. Comparative evidence points toward a different outcome for generalist foragers. Groups that exploited a broader range of resources appear to have weathered environmental fluctuations more effectively. By diversifying their diets and maintaining flexible movement patterns, they reduced reliance on any single prey species or habitat. This approach did not maximize short-term yield, but it increased resilience. Archaeological assemblages associated with generalist strategies often persist across longer spans of environmental change, suggesting that adaptability, rather than optimization, conferred survival advantage. Selection pressures reinforced this pattern over time. As environments continue to fluctuate, strategies that favoured narrow specialisation were repeatedly tested and often eliminated. Those that allowed for adjustment, substitution and movement endured. This process did not require conscious planning at the level of species. It unfolded through differential survival. Groups capable of loosening their attachment to particular resources were more likely to leave descendants. Those that could not were filtered out by circumstances beyond their control. The cost of staying put extended beyond subsistence alone. Social structures tied closely to specific landscapes also faced strain when those landscapes changed. Rituals, seasonal gatherings, and cooperative practices often depended on predictable cycles of abundance. When these cycles broke down, social cohesion could suffer. Groups forced to remain in deteriorating conditions may have experienced increased competition, stress, and conflict as resources dwindled. Movement, by contrast, offered a release valve. It allowed groups to reset social dynamics in new contexts and to redistribute pressure across wider spaces. It's important to note that movement itself carried risks. Travel exposed people to unfamiliar terrain, new competitors, and uncertain resources. Yet the archaeological record implies that these risks were often preferable to the slow attrition of staying too long in one place. Stillness magnified the impact of environmental decline. Movement diluted it. By spreading exposure across multiple landscapes, mobile groups avoided concentrating their fate in a single failing system. From this perspective, stability reveals itself as an active condition rather than a neutral one. To remain in place required constant reinforcement of a relationship with the environment that was increasingly unreliable. As conditions shifted, the effort required to maintain that relationship grew. What once felt safe gradually became costly. The danger lay not in change itself, but in assuming that the past could continue to support the present. The archaeological record does not present this lesson as a sudden revelation. It appears instead as a slow accumulation of outcomes across generations. Groups that lingered too long disappeared from the record. Those that moved on reappear elsewhere, adapting their subsistence strategies to new conditions. Over time, this pattern shaped human behaviour at a deep level. Movement became not just a response to crisis, but a proactive strategy to avoid it. In this light, the notion of staying put as a default human desire becomes difficult to sustain. Early humans did not inherit a world that rewarded stillness. They inherited one that punished it under certain conditions. The ability to recognize when stability had become liability was as important as the ability to exploit abundance when it appeared. This recognition required attention, flexibility, and a willingness to release attachments that no longer serve survival. Stability was not neutral. It carried risks that movement could dilute. Survival favoured those who could loosen their grip on yesterday. A moment when the world you inhabit cannot be memorized. When paths shift, seasons misalign, and the landmarks that once guided you no longer point the way. What kind of mind survives in a world that refuses to settle, where experience cannot be reduced to habit and certainty dissolves before it can harden into rule? We do not know for certain when neurological plasticity became a defining feature of Homo sapiens, but the evidence suggests that it emerged not as an abstract advantage, but as a direct response to instability. Compared to other primates and even to earlier hominin species, humans show an unusually prolonged period of brain development. Childhood stretches longer. Dependency persists. Learning remains open-ended well into adolescence and beyond. This extended developmental window is costly. It requires sustained care, social tolerance, and delayed productivity. Yet under conditions of environmental unpredictability, it offers something rare: time to adapt before committing fully to any single way of living. Extended childhood allowed young humans to absorb variability rather than memorize fixed patterns. In stable environments, instinct can be refined into reliable response. In unstable ones, instinct risks becoming obsolete. A mind that matures slowly can remain sensitive to change longer, adjusting expectations as conditions shift. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation indirectly through patterns of behaviour that vary within the same populations. Tool use, subsistence strategies, and movement patterns differ not only across regions, but within sites occupied by closely related groups. This variability suggests that learning, experimentation, and adjustment were tolerated and even encouraged. Uniformity was not enforced. Flexibility was preserved. Cognitive flexibility in this context functioned as an adaptive advantage. Humans did not rely solely on inherited behavioral programs triggered automatically by specific stimuli. Instead, they learned to interpret cues, weigh alternatives, and modify responses. This does not imply the absence of instinct, but rather a recalibration of its role. Instinct provided a foundation, but learning filled in the gaps left by an unpredictable world. When prey changed, when routes failed, when familiar signals no longer aligned with outcomes, learned behaviour could be revised. A rigid response would have been dangerous. Neuroscientific research into modern human brains reinforces this picture. Humans exhibit a high degree of neural plasticity, particularly in regions associated with planning, social cognition, and decision-making. While we must be cautious in projecting modern brain function directly into the deep past, comparative studies suggest that this plasticity is not a recent development. It is likely rooted in selection pressures that favoured adaptability over efficiency. Brains optimised for adjustment rather than optimization would have been better suited to environments where the rules change faster than they could be mastered. Behavioural variability within populations offers further insight. At many Middle Stone Age sites, archaeologists find evidence that different groups living at the same time adopted different solutions to similar problems. Some relied more heavily on hunting, others on gathering. Some favoured certain tool forms, others modified them. This diversity is difficult to explain if human behaviour was tightly constrained by genetic programming or rigid cultural norms. It makes more sense if individuals and groups were permitted a range of acceptable responses, with success determined by outcome rather than conformity. Such variability carries risks. Too much divergence can fragment social cohesion. Too little can trap a group in failing strategies. The balance appears to have been maintained through shared learning rather than strict instruction. Knowledge circulated, but it was not standardized to the point of rigidity. Young individuals learned by observing multiple approaches, internalizing principles rather than procedures. This allowed them to adapt those principles when circumstances demanded it. Learning became less about copying and more about understanding relationships between actions and consequences. The idea of brains shaped by unfinished maps captures this dynamic well. Early humans navigated landscapes that could not be fully charted in advance. Routes changed, resources appeared and vanished. No map remained accurate for long. Under such conditions, the mind itself became a provisional map, constantly updated and revised. Memory was not a static archive, but a working tool. Expectations were held lightly. Decisions were made with the understanding that revision might soon be necessary. This orientation toward revision had implications beyond immediate survival. It influenced how humans related to uncertainty itself. Rather than seeking a final solution to environmental challenges, early humans appear to have accepted uncertainty as a persistent feature of existence. The goal was not to eliminate variability, but to remain functional within it. Cognitive strategies that allowed for reassessment, reinterpretation, and change were favoured. Over time, these strategies became embedded in the architecture of the human mind. Importantly, this does not suggest that early humans were perpetually improvising without structure. Patterns existed, knowledge accumulated, traditions formed, but these patterns remained open to modification. When conditions shifted, they could be altered without dismantling the entire system. This capacity to revise without collapse distinguishes adaptive flexibility from chaos. It reflects a mind prepared to move not only across landscapes, but across ways of thinking. The cost of this flexibility was complexity. A brain capable of constant adjustment consumes energy, demands social support, and introduces uncertainty into decision-making. Yet the benefits outweighed these costs in a world defined by change. Selection favoured minds that could hold multiple possibilities in tension, delay commitment, and revise plans as new information emerged. Over generations, this shaped a species less defined by fixed instincts and more by learned responsiveness. Seen through this lens, the human mind did not evolve to perfect one way of living. It evolved to revise it. Thought became a moving shelter rather than a fixed structure. And within this unfinished mental landscape, something quieter but equally consequential was taking shape. Learning itself became social rather than solitary. Knowledge was not stored in fixed instructions, but distributed across relationships, gestures, shared attention, and repeated exposure. Young humans did not simply copy outcomes. They watched processes. They saw mistakes, partial successes, and alternative attempts. This kind of learning is slower than instinct, but it is far more resilient. It allows behaviour to survive even when conditions invalidate the original solution that produced it. Archaeological traces hint at this tolerance for error. In many assemblages, imperfect tools appear alongside more refined ones, produced from the same raw materials in the same locations. These are not necessarily signs of incompetence. They suggest spaces where learning was permitted to unfold without immediate penalty. A flawed tool was not useless if it still functioned well enough. Precision mattered, but not at the cost of adaptability. This tolerance would have allowed young individuals to experiment while still contributing marginally to group survival, reinforcing learning without catastrophic risk. Play may also have played a role, not as leisure in the modern sense, but as low-stakes exploration. Objects were handled, struck, rearranged. Movements were practiced without immediate necessity. Such behaviours leave little direct archaeological signature, but they align with what we observe in modern human development and in comparative primate studies. In unstable environments, the ability to explore possibilities without committing fully to any one path would have been invaluable. Play creates mental flexibility before it is required. Social structure supported this cognitive openness. Extended kin networks and cooperative care reduced the pressure on any single individual to perform optimally at all times. This buffering effect allowed learning to continue even when immediate efficiency was low. A child could take longer to mature. An adolescent could test alternative strategies. An adult could revise habits without immediate exclusion. The group absorbed the cost and in return gained a broader repertoire of responses when conditions shifted. Importantly, this does not imply endless openness. Constraints existed. Certain behaviours were reinforced because they worked often enough. Others faded because they did not. But the system remained porous. It allowed new information to enter and old assumptions to be questioned. Over generations, this produced minds accustomed not only to change in the environment, but to change in understanding. Beliefs could be provisional, expectations could be adjusted. Certainty was never absolute. This cognitive posture left subtle marks on human behaviour that extend far beyond survival. It shaped how humans approached uncertainty itself. Rather than demanding complete knowledge before acting, they learned to act with incomplete information, revising as they went. This capacity is neither optimism nor recklessness. It is a calibrated response to a world where waiting for certainty could be fatal, and clinging to outdated models even more so. In such a world, the mind becomes less like a finished map and more like a draft that is constantly redrawn. Lines are penciled, erased, and penciled again. What matters is not arriving at a final version, but remaining able to revise. This orientation does not eliminate fear or doubt, it accommodates them. It allows thinking to move alongside the body, adapting as landscapes and circumstances demand. Thought, in this sense, did not promise safety, it offered mobility. It allowed humans to carry a form of shelter that could not be washed away by changing climates or abandoned with a campsite. Thought became a moving shelter rather than a fixed structure. Imagine this. You know the path ahead will keep you alive, yet every part of you resists taking the first step. Your chest tightens, your attention sharpens. Familiar ground pulls at you, even as reason urges movement. Why does change still feel like loss, even when it ensures survival? We do not know for certain how early humans named this sensation, or whether they named it at all, but the evidence suggests that the emotional resistance we associate with fear is not a cultural accident. It is a deeply conserved biological response, shaped long before language, and refined under conditions where uncertainty carried real costs. Stress responses linked to unpredictability appear across mammals and are especially pronounced in species that rely on learning and flexible behaviour. For early Homo sapiens living in unstable environments, uncertainty was not an abstract concept. It was a daily condition. The body responded accordingly. At the core of this response lie threat detection systems tuned not only to immediate danger, but to deviation from expectation. Sudden silence where sound is expected. Absence where presence once existed. Change itself becomes a signal. Neurological systems associated with vigilance respond strongly when familiar patterns break. Cortisol levels rise, attention narrows. The body prepares for action or restraint. These responses do not distinguish between beneficial change and harmful change. They register difference first, meaning later. This prioritization reflects an ancient logic. In volatile environments, novelty often preceded risk. Treating change cautiously increased the likelihood of survival. Paleoneurological evidence cannot show us hormone levels directly, but comparative biology and modern neuroscience provide a consistent framework. In mammals exposed to unpredictable conditions, stress hormones facilitate rapid assessment and readiness. Heightened vigilance allows detection of subtle cues that might otherwise be missed. This is metabolically expensive, but effective when conditions shift without warning. For early humans navigating fluctuating climates, moving prey, and unstable landscapes, such responses would have been repeatedly activated. Over generations, these systems became tightly integrated into the human nervous system. Alongside hormonal responses, the brain exhibits a bias toward familiar patterns. Neural circuits strengthen through repetition. Predictable environments allow efficient processing. When patterns hold, energy is conserved. When patterns break, the brain must work harder. This increased effort is experienced subjectively as discomfort. Familiarity feels safe not because it always is, but because it demands less cognitive and physiological expenditure. In contrast, change requires constant monitoring, reassessment, and recalibration. Fear emerges not simply as alarm, but as a signal that resources are being diverted toward uncertainty. This bias toward familiarity has survival value in volatile conditions. Caution slows decision-making when outcomes are unclear. It reduces the likelihood of reckless movement into unknown territory. For early humans, an impulsive response to every environmental fluctuation could have been fatal. Leaving too soon, moving without adequate preparation, or abandoning viable resources prematurely carried risks of their own. Emotional resistance functioned as a brake. It forced deliberation. It demanded evidence that change was necessary before action followed. Archaeological patterns support this interpretation indirectly. We see evidence of hesitation built into human responses to environmental change. Groups did not immediately abandon landscapes at the first sign of decline. They monitored conditions. They adjusted strategies incrementally. Only when thresholds were crossed did movement occur. This suggests a balance between responsiveness and restraint. Fear did not paralyze adaptation. It regulated its timing. It ensured that change was neither ignored nor embraced blindly. Importantly, fear responses did not operate in isolation. They were embedded within social contexts. Emotional signals communicated caution to others. Heightened alertness spread through groups. Decisions about movement or persistence were rarely individual. Shared fear could synchronize attention and encourage collective assessment. This social dimension amplified the adaptive value of fear. It transformed a personal sensation into a group-level signal, aligning behavior without the need for explicit instruction. Over time, this integration of fear and learning shaped human decision-making. Fear did not oppose adaptability, it refined it. By resisting change initially, early humans avoided overreacting to short-term fluctuations. By remaining sensitive to persistent signals, they avoided remaining too long in deteriorating conditions. This balance reduced the extremes of both rigidity and impulsivity. Emotional resistance became part of a regulatory system that kept adaptation within survivable bounds. The modern tendency to interpret fear of change as irrational overlooks this history. In deep time, fear was rarely misplaced. It reflected accumulated experience encoded biologically. It warned against assuming that new conditions would be benign. At the same time, it did not prevent change when change became unavoidable. The archaeological record shows that humans moved, adapted, and revised their strategies repeatedly, despite the discomfort involved. Fear accompanied these shifts, but it did not halt them. It moderated them. Seen this way, fear emerges not as an enemy of progress, but as a stabilizing force within a changing world. It slowed adaptation just enough to prevent collapse through haste. It kept attention focused on risk, while learning expanded the range of possible responses. Without fear, adaptability could have tipped into recklessness. Without adaptability, fear could have frozen behavior entirely. Survival required both. The emotional weight associated with change today echoes this ancient balance. The sense of loss, felt even when change is beneficial, reflect systems designed to protect against irreversible mistakes. Fear signals that something is being relinquished before its replacement is fully known. This sensation is not a flaw to be eliminated. It is a reminder of the costs embedded in uncertainty. Early humans lived with this tension constantly. It shaped when they moved, how they learned, and how they survived. Fear of change was not a mistake. It was part of the balance that kept adaptation from becoming recklessness. The mind learned to hesitate even as the body learned to move. Picture a moment when the land begins to shift faster than the relationships holding a group together. When familiar roots falter, resources thin unevenly, and the question is no longer where to go, but whether everyone will go together. What happens to a group when the world changes faster than its bonds? We do not know for certain how early human groups reached collective decisions under such pressure, but the evidence suggests that social coordination became not a secondary advantage but a central requirement for survival. In variable landscapes, where resources appeared and disappeared unpredictably, individual success offered little protection. A lone hunter might find food one day and fail the next. A solitary gatherer might locate water that vanished before it could be shared. What endured was not individual brilliance, but the ability to align effort, timing, and movement across many people at once. Cooperation transformed scattered knowledge into collective resilience. Archaeological traces point repeatedly toward cooperative foraging as a defining feature of early human life in unstable environments. Faunal remains at many Middle Stone Age sites indicate shared access to prey rather than individualized consumption. Cuts on bones suggest coordinated processing rather than isolated scavenging. Plant remains appear in contexts that imply communal gathering and redistribution. These patterns are subtle but consistent. They reflect a way of living in which food was acquired, prepared, and consumed through shared labour. In landscapes where availability fluctuated sharply, pooling effort reduced risk. What one person missed, another might find. What one day failed, another day could succeed. Cooperation smoothed the sharp edges of uncertainty. Group decision-making under resource uncertainty left fewer direct traces, yet its effects are visible in patterns of movement. Shared routes appear again and again in the archaeological record, suggesting that movement was rarely impulsive or individual. Paths through landscapes were learned, remembered, and transmitted across generations. These routes were not static. They shifted with changing conditions, but they did so collectively. Decisions about when to leave a place, when to return, and when to avoid it altogether appear to have been made through accumulated experience rather than individual impulse. The cost of a wrong decision was borne by all. This alone would have discouraged unilateral action. Seasonal knowledge played a crucial role in this coordination. Early humans appear to have tracked not only where resources were, but when they were likely to be accessible. This required shared memory. One individual might remember a water source that persisted through a previous dry phase. Another might recall a hunting ground that became productive only after rains. Alone, such memories were fragile. Together, they formed a more reliable guide. The group became a living archive, carrying layered knowledge that no single person could hold in full. Movement guided by this collective memory allowed humans to navigate landscapes that were too complex and too changeable for individual mapping. Social penalties for dangerous individualism reinforced these patterns. While direct evidence of sanction is difficult to recover archaeologically, comparative anthropology and primate studies offer relevant insights. In cooperative species, individuals who act in ways that endanger group cohesion often face exclusion, reduced support, or loss of status. For early humans, whose survival depended on shared labour and mutual protection, such penalties would have been severe. An individual who moved too early, hunted alone recklessly, or hoarded resources would have increased risk for everyone. Over time, behaviours that undermined coordination were likely discouraged through social pressure long before they could become habitual. This does not imply uniformity or the absence of disagreement. On the contrary, coordinated flexibility requires negotiation. Different perspectives had to be weighed. Competing memories had to be reconciled. Decisions emerge not from dominance alone, but from repeated evaluation of outcomes. Groups that could accommodate internal variation while still moving together would have been better positioned to respond to environmental change. Too much rigidity would have prevented adaptation. Too much fragmentation would have dissolved cooperation. The balance lay in shared movement with room for adjustment. The survival advantage of coordinated flexibility becomes especially clear when contrasted with species that lacked it. Many animals respond to environmental change through instinctive migration, or dispersal patterns that are difficult to alter quickly. When conditions shift beyond those patterns, populations can collapse. Early humans, by contrast, could revise their movements through discussion, observation, and shared learning. This capacity did not eliminate risk, but it redistributed it across social networks. Movement was no longer a solitary gamble. It was a collective strategy. As groups moved together, relationships themselves were reshaped by motion. Proximity changed. Roles shifted. New alliances formed as old ones loosened. Social bonds had to remain adaptable, just like routes and strategies. Archaeological evidence of variable group sizes and changing site compositions suggests that early human social units were fluid. Membership could expand or contract depending on circumstances. This flexibility allowed groups to respond to environmental pressures without fracturing completely. Social structure became another tool for navigating change. The emotional dimension of this coordination should not be underestimated. Moving together required trust. Individuals had to rely on others to act in ways that supported collective survival, even when personal preference diverged. Fear, discussed earlier, played a role here as well, signalling caution when cohesion was threatened. Shared hesitation could slow movement until consensus formed. Shared urgency could accelerate it when delay became dangerous. Emotion, cognition, and social structure intertwined to regulate group behavior under pressure. Over generations, these dynamics shaped the human capacity for collective action. Cooperation became not just a moral ideal, but an ecological adaptation. It allowed humans to occupy environments that would have overwhelmed solitary foragers. It enabled movement across fragmented landscapes without catastrophic loss. It turned variability into a navigable condition rather than an existential threat. Seen through this lens, the story of human movement is inseparable from the story of human relationships. Bodies learned to travel farther and more efficiently, but it was social bonds that made such movement survivable. The ability to move together transformed how humans related to space, time, and one another. It created a species for whom survival was not an individual achievement, but a shared process. Change could not be survived alone. It demanded collective motion. Movement reshaped not just bodies, but relationships. And yet, moving together demanded more than shared direction. It required the slow calibration of trust across difference. Within any group, individuals varied in age, strength, memory, and risk tolerance. Some remembered routes that others had never walked. Some sensed danger sooner. Others resisted leaving until necessity pressed hard. Coordinated movement meant allowing these differences to exist, without letting them fracture the group. The archaeological record hints at this tolerance through variability in activity areas within single sites. Different tasks occurred simultaneously, suggesting parallel roles rather than uniform behaviour. Cohesion did not erase difference, it contained it. Signals became crucial in this process. Before language could formalise instruction, bodies communicated intention through posture, pace, proximity, and pause. A slowing of steps could signal caution. A gathering of bodies could signal deliberation. A collective halt could replace debate. These embodied cues allowed groups to synchronize without explicit command. Such coordination reduced the cost of decision-making in moments when speed mattered. It also prevented escalation when disagreement arose. The body became a medium for consensus. Shared movement also reshaped obligations. When a group committed to a route, individuals accepted responsibilities that extended beyond personal survival. The young had to be supported through longer distances. The injured required accommodation. Those carrying knowledge were expected to share it. These obligations created feedback loops that reinforced cooperation. Helping another person move increased the likelihood that help would be returned when needed. Over time, these exchanges stabilized group cohesion in environments that offered little external stability. Archaeological evidence of variable group sizes suggests that coordination was dynamic rather than fixed. Groups could split temporarily and rejoin later, maintaining social ties across distance. Such fission and fusion patterns allowed humans to respond flexibly to resource distribution while preserving broader networks. Movement did not dissolve relationships, it redistributed them. A person might travel with one subset of the group during one season and another during the next. This fluidity reduced pressure on any single configuration to persist indefinitely. The consequences of failed coordination are visible in negative space. Sites that show abrupt abandonment without subsequent reoccupation sometimes coincide with evidence of ecological stress. While causation is difficult to establish, the absence of continuity suggests that not all groups navigated change successfully. When coordination faltered, movement could become fragmented. Individuals might leave without sufficient support. Others might remain too long. The costs of such breakdowns would have been severe, reinforcing the value of collective decision-making in future generations. Importantly, coordination did not guarantee success. Groups still faced loss, uncertainty, and error. What it offered was a margin of resilience. By moving together, humans reduced the variance of outcomes. No single failure determined survival. Risk was distributed, knowledge was pooled, recovery from misjudgment became possible. This margin may explain why humans could persist in regions that experienced repeated climatic disruption while other species declined. Over deep time, these practices shaped not only survival strategies, but social expectations. To belong to a group meant to move with it when necessary. Refusal to do so carried consequences. Acceptance brought protection. Identity became tied to shared motion, not static location. People were defined less by where they were than by who they moved with. As landscapes shifted, so did the architecture of human relationships. Movement etched patterns of cooperation into social life, binding individuals through shared risk and shared direction. The path forward was never taken alone. Movement reshaped not just bodies, but relationships. A camp goes quiet. The fire cools, footprints fade, nothing solid remains that can be gathered or carried. What did early humans take with them when nothing could be stored? We do not know for certain how much material culture early Homo sapiens left behind intentionally, but the archaeological record makes one thing clear. Much of what sustained survival did not travel as objects at all. Campsites appear and disappear across landscapes with remarkable lightness. Tools were often remade rather than preserved. Shelters left few traces. What endured between these moments of presence and absence was not a stockpile of goods, but a continuity of knowledge. In the silence between camps, culture itself became the most durable survival resource. Oral transmission formed the backbone of this continuity. Long before writing, and long before permanent settlement, information had to move without weight. Seasonal patterns, shifts in rainfall, animal movements, and the timing of plant availability could not be recorded externally. They were learned, remembered, and retold. We see indirect evidence of this in the precision with which humans returned to locations that offered resources only intermittently. Water sources that emerged briefly during certain climatic phases were revisited generations later. This suggests not random rediscovery, but remembered routes and timings passed across time through speech and shared practice. Memory extended beyond immediate surroundings. Archaeological distributions indicate that early humans often navigated landscapes spanning hundreds of kilometers. Such movement would have been impossible without knowledge of distant passages, safe corridors, and places to avoid. River crossings, mountain gaps, and seasonal bottlenecks left no permanent markers. Yet groups moved through them repeatedly. The most plausible explanation is that this information was carried in narrative form. Stories encoded direction, danger, and timing in ways that could be recalled without physical reference. Knowledge survived by being told. Crucially, this knowledge was embedded in stories rather than objects. An object can be lost, broken, or abandoned. A story can be retold as long as someone remembers it. Ethnographic studies of mobile foraging societies show how narratives often carry layered information beneath their surface. A tale about an ancestor's journey may describe not only identity, but the sequence of waterholes encountered along a route. A myth about a dangerous place may preserve memory of ecological hazards long after their immediate causes vanished. While we must be cautious in projecting modern examples into deep time, the pattern suggests a long-standing strategy. Storytelling functioned as a compression technology for survival information. Teaching became inseparable from this process. Knowledge that could not be stored had to be renewed continually. This placed enormous importance on teaching as a survival technology. Young individuals did not simply observe. They were instructed through repetition, correction, and shared experience. Archaeological evidence of consistent behavioral patterns across generations implies structured transmission rather than accidental learning. Skills, routes, and timing were reinforced until they became reliable. Teaching ensured that memory did not fracture with the loss of individuals. When elders died, their knowledge survived if it had been passed on. The mobile nature of this archive shaped how culture itself was organized. Instead of being anchored to place, culture moved with people. Songs, rituals, and shared practices traveled across landscapes, adapting slightly as conditions changed. This mobility allowed humans to detach survival knowledge from any single environment. When a place became unviable, its memory did not have to be erased. It could be held until conditions shifted again. Culture functioned as a living repository, flexible enough to move and durable enough to persist. The silence between camps thus carried meaning. It was not an absence of culture, but a pause in its material expression. When a campsite lay empty, the knowledge associated with it did not disappear. It lived on in memory and speech, ready to be activated when needed. This explains why some sites show repeated occupations separated by long gaps. The place was not forgotten. It was held in reserve. Knowing when to leave was matched by knowing when to return. This form of cultural storage also imposed limits. Memory can distort. Stories can drift. transmission is never perfect, yet the archaeological record suggests that accuracy was maintained well enough to support survival across volatile conditions. Redundancy likely played a role. Knowledge was shared among multiple individuals. Stories were retold in communal settings. Errors could be corrected through collective experience. Over time, narratives that aligned poorly with reality would have been revised or discarded. Culture remained adaptive, not static. Importantly, this system did not privilege accumulation. Carrying too much information that no longer applied could be as dangerous as forgetting. Cultural knowledge had to remain relevant. This encouraged selective retention. What was remembered was what mattered for movement, timing, and safety. Excess detail faded. Core patterns persisted. In this way, culture mirrored the environments it addressed. It stayed light enough to move. Seen from this perspective, early human survival depended less on mastery of place and more on mastery of departure. Knowing when to stay mattered, but knowing when to leave mattered more. Culture preserved the signals that indicated decline, danger, or opportunity. It allowed humans to respond before conditions became catastrophic. This anticipatory quality distinguishes cultural memory from simple habit. It was forward-looking, not merely preservative. The silence between camps therefore represents a critical space in human history. It is where survival was negotiated not through action, but through remembrance. The gap between one occupation and the next was bridged by shared understanding rather than physical continuity. Humans learned to trust memory as much as material evidence. In a world that could not be fixed, knowledge itself became portable shelter. What endured was not place or possession, but knowing when to leave. Memory became a compass where maps could not exist, and this reliance on memory reshaped how time itself was experienced. Without permanent structures or written records, continuity depended on repetition. Events were not anchored to dates, but to cycles. Rains returned, herds passed through, winds shifted direction. Knowledge was organized around recurrence rather than chronology. To remember something was not to place it in the past, but to know when it would matter again. This temporal orientation allowed humans to anticipate change instead of reacting to it blindly. Ritual likely played a role in stabilizing this memory. Repeated actions performed at specific times of year or during key transitions reinforced shared knowledge without requiring explicit explanation. A gathering before departure, a shared meal before movement, a gesture repeated when entering unfamiliar terrain. These practices leave little archaeological trace, yet they align with patterns observed in mobile societies where ritual functions as a mnemonic device. It marks moments that matter and binds information to emotion, increasing the likelihood of recall under pressure. Language itself may have been shaped by these demands. Vocabulary related to landscape, movement, and timing would have carried survival weight. Words for dryness, abundance, danger, or passage encoded more than description. They condensed experience into communicable signals. Over time, such linguistic compression allowed complex environmental knowledge to be transmitted efficiently across generations. While the exact structure of early human language remains unknown, its functional role in coordinating movement and memory is difficult to ignore. The fragility of this system was offset by its adaptability. When knowledge failed, it could be corrected. When a remembered water source dried permanently, the story changed. When a safe route became dangerous, warnings replaced instructions. Culture did not preserve truth in the abstract. It preserved usefulness. This pragmatic orientation allowed memory to remain aligned with shifting realities. In this way, Culture avoided becoming a burden. It stayed responsive to the world it described. The act of teaching also shaped social bonds. Elders gained relevance not through control of resources but through control of knowledge. Younger individuals depended on them for orientation rather than sustenance alone. This reconfigured authority within groups. Power flowed through memory. Those who could recall, interpret, and convey patterns of change became central figures. Their role was not to prevent movement, but to guide it. This placed restraint and foresight at the heart of social structure. There is a quiet humility in this arrangement. Knowledge was never final. Even the most trusted memories could be revised. Certainty was provisional. What mattered was not being right forever, but being right long enough to move safely. This stance toward knowledge stands in contrast to later traditions that sought permanence through monuments or texts. Early humans accepted impermanence and built systems that could withstand it. As camps fell silent and traces faded, something invisible persisted. Stories carried across valleys. Lessons echoed through generations. Roots existed not on the ground, but in minds. The spaces between camps were not empty. They were filled with remembered paths and anticipated returns. Culture did not anchor humans to place, it freed them from it. In this sense, memory was not merely a record of what had been. It was a tool for what might come next. It allowed humans to navigate absence, to survive intervals of loss, and to move with intention rather than desperation. Memory became a compass where maps could not exist. A method that once kept you alive now quietly increases your chances of dying. The prey no longer arrives when expected. The landscape responds differently, yet the hands still reach for familiar tools. Could comfort itself become a threat? We do not know for certain when early humans first recognized that familiarity could be dangerous, but the archaeological record suggests that this realization emerged repeatedly and independently across deep time. Sites once associated with successful subsistence strategies are abandoned, not because the strategy failed immediately, but because conditions changed around it. What had worked before began to misalign with reality. The danger did not arrive as catastrophe. It arrived as lag, a delay between expectation and outcome. In that delay, survival risk accumulated. One of the clearest signals of this pattern lies in the abandonment of hunting techniques that had previously proven effective. In several regions, archaeologists observe long periods during which specific hunting approaches dominate, followed by abrupt shifts or complete disappearance of those methods. There is no evidence that the techniques suddenly stopped functioning everywhere. Rather, environmental changes altered prey behavior, migration timing, or availability. Strategies optimized for one configuration of the ecosystem became liabilities under another. Continuing to rely on them meant expending energy for diminishing returns. Dietary shifts provide a parallel record. Stable isotope analyses and faunal assemblages show that human diets change frequently, sometimes abandoning preferred resources even when they were still present. This suggests not desperation, but recalibration. Foods that were once reliable may have become seasonal, unpredictable, or insufficient. In response, humans diversified intake or redirected effort toward less familiar sources. These changes were not linear improvements. They often involved reverting to older practices or experimenting with new combinations. Adaptation did not follow a straight path. It branched, doubled back, and occasionally erased its own tracks. This pattern challenges the idea of tradition as a stabilizing force. In many early human contexts, tradition appears remarkably flexible. Practices persisted only as long as they aligned with current conditions. When they did not, they were discarded. This does not imply cultural amnesia. Knowledge of past strategies was retained, but it was not obeyed automatically. Familiarity did not confer authority. Usefulness did. The archaeological record shows little evidence of rigid adherence to methods simply because they were inherited. Instead, there is repeated evidence of selective abandonment. Flexibility overriding tradition carries social cost. Practices are embedded in identity, cooperation, and shared meaning. Abandoning them risks destabilizing group cohesion. Yet the persistence of such shifts suggests that early humans tolerated this instability when survival demanded it. Cultural continuity was valuable, but not at the expense of viability. Groups that clung too tightly to familiar routines likely faced greater risk when environments change faster than their habits could adapt. Crucially, there is no sign of cumulative progress toward a final optimal strategy. Instead, survival strategies appear episodic and contingent. What worked in one context failed in another. Adaptation occurred through discontinuity rather than refinement alone. This is visible in the repeated reinvention of similar solutions across different times and places. Humans did not perfect a single way of living. They learned to abandon it when necessary. This capacity required a subtle cognitive shift. It meant treating the past as informative rather than prescriptive. Experience offered guidance, but not instruction. Memory provided options, not rules. When conditions diverge from expectation, past success could no longer dictate present action. This stance reduced the risk of being trapped by precedent. It allowed humans to recognize when continuity itself became hazardous. The emotional difficulty of this process should not be underestimated. Familiar practices carry psychological comfort. They reduce uncertainty and cognitive load. Letting them go introduces doubt. Yet the archaeological record implies that humans repeatedly chose uncertainty over misplaced confidence. They accepted the discomfort of change to avoid the greater danger of persistence. This choice does not reflect optimism. It reflects pragmatism shaped by repeated exposure to environmental volatility. In this sense, adaptation required a kind of betrayal. Habits formed through success had to be questioned. Skills honed over generations had to be suspended. This was not an act of rejection, but of recalibration. The past was not erased. It was repositioned. Its value lay in lessons learned, not instructions to be followed indefinitely. Over deep time, this orientation reshaped how humans related to knowledge itself. Knowledge became provisional. Strategies were held lightly. Confidence was tempered by awareness of change. The ability to let go of what once worked became as important as the ability to learn something new. Survival depended not on loyalty to tradition, but on responsiveness to context. When familiarity became a risk, humans learned to move beyond it. The past offered lessons, not instructions, and this willingness to abandon familiarity reshaped how confidence itself was calibrated. Confidence could no longer rest on repetition alone. It had to remain sensitive to mismatch. A practice that felt comfortable might still be wrong. This required a subtle internal discipline, the ability to notice diminishing returns before failure became catastrophic. Archaeological sequences suggest that humans often shifted strategies before complete collapse occurred. This implies attentiveness to early signals rather than reliance on dramatic thresholds. Small discrepancies mattered. Missed hunts, altered migration timing, reduced yields. These were read as warnings, not anomalies. Such sensitivity likely depended on collective evaluation rather than individual judgment. A single failed attempt could be dismissed. A pattern of strain could not. Groups appear to have monitored outcomes over time, comparing expectation with result. When the gap widened, adjustment followed. This process did not guarantee accuracy, but it reduced inertia. It allowed humans to respond to trend rather than shock. In doing so, they avoided the most dangerous form of comfort, the belief that tomorrow would resemble yesterday closely enough to ignore change. This orientation also reframed skill. Mastery was no longer defined solely by perfection of technique, but by awareness of its limits. A skilled hunter was not only someone who could execute a method well, but someone who knew when that method no longer applied. Expertise included the capacity to relinquish expertise. This paradox runs quietly through the archaeological record. Some of the most refined technologies disappear abruptly, replaced by simpler or different forms. Refinement did not ensure persistence. Appropriateness did. There is evidence that such discontinuities were not always gradual. At times, shifts appear abrupt within the archaeological sequence. This may reflect periods when environmental change accelerated beyond the pace of incremental adjustment. In these moments, familiar practices would have failed rapidly. Groups faced compressed decision windows. The ability to abandon a trusted strategy quickly could determine survival. Hesitation carried cost. Yet the willingness to act decisively required prior acceptance that tradition could be wrong. Importantly, abandoning a strategy did not erase the knowledge behind it. Old methods could be retained as contingency options, recalled if conditions aligned again. This layered approach to knowledge allowed humans to maintain a repertoire rather than a single solution. Strategies moved in and out of use as environments fluctuated. The past remained present as possibility, not obligation. This dynamic archive of practices offered resilience without rigidity. Such flexibility also shaped social memory. Stories of past success did not function as commandments. They functioned as examples. A tale about a successful hunt might emphasize conditions rather than technique. When listeners encountered similar conditions, the story regained relevance. When conditions differed, the story served as contrast rather than guide. In this way, memory supported discernment rather than imitation. The cost of misjudging familiarity was not theoretical. Groups that failed to adjust likely vanished without trace. Their disappearance appears only as silence in the record. What we observe are the survivors, those whose strategies shifted often enough to remain viable. This creates an illusion of continuity. In reality, survival was punctuated by countless acts of abandonment, revision, and selective forgetting. The archaeological record preserves what adapted, not what persisted unchanged. Over deep time, this pattern shaped a species less attached to methods than to outcomes. Humans learned to value effectiveness over elegance, relevance over tradition. This does not imply constant innovation. It implies constant evaluation. Change was not pursued for its own sake. It was accepted when familiarity stopped aligning with survival. In this sense, comfort became dangerous, not because it was pleasant, but because it could dull attention. Familiarity reduced vigilance. It made early warning signs easier to ignore. By learning to distrust comfort under certain conditions, humans preserved their capacity to respond. Adaptation required betraying habits that once worked, not out of disloyalty, but out of recognition. The past offered lessons, not instructions. You make a choice that keeps you alive, yet something in you aches as if a piece has been taken, a place left behind, a routine abandoned, a pattern broken. Why does adaptation always feel like something is being taken away? We do not know for certain when this emotional asymmetry first emerged in human history, but the evidence suggests that sensitivity to loss evolved alongside adaptability itself. Change was never experienced as neutral information. It arrived weighted, registered not only in decision-making but in feeling. Archaeology cannot recover emotion directly, yet the behavioural patterns preserved in sites of departure, abandonment and transition suggest that early humans did not treat change as a clean substitution. What was gained did not simply replace what was lost. The loss remained present, carried forward psychologically even as conditions demanded movement. Modern cognitive science describes a bias toward loss over gain, where the removal of something familiar registers more strongly than the acquisition of something new. While we must be cautious in projecting modern models backward, comparative evidence indicates that this bias is deeply rooted. Mammalian nervous systems respond more intensely to the disappearance of expected resources than to the appearance of new ones. For early humans, this sensitivity would have been reinforced repeatedly. Environments shifted, resources vanished, campsites became untenable. Each transition involved not only opportunity but subtraction. Adaptation required letting go, and letting go carried cost. Emotional attachment to known patterns likely amplified this effect. Familiar routes, reliable water sources, and established foraging grounds reduced uncertainty. They allowed energy to be conserved and attention to relax. When such patterns broke down, the loss was not merely material, it disrupted predictability. The emotional response to this disruption functioned as a signal. Something important had changed. Attention needed to be sharpened. Decisions needed to be weighed carefully. Loss sensitivity drew cognitive resources toward reassessment at moments when error would be costly. There is growing evidence that grief responses may have deep evolutionary roots, tied not only to social loss, but to environmental change. While formal mourning practices appear later in the archaeological record, more subtle expressions of loss may have accompanied earlier transitions. The abandonment of a productive landscape would have involved more than logistical adjustment. It would have required psychological disengagement. The emotional difficulty of this process may have served an adaptive function. By making loss salient, it discouraged casual abandonment and ensured that change was not undertaken lightly. Grief, in this context, does not imply despair. It implies valuation. Something mattered enough to be missed. This valuation helped calibrate future decisions. A resource that had been lost painfully would not be forgotten easily. Its memory could inform return if conditions allowed. Emotional attachment thus preserved information across absence. Loss sensitivity kept the past accessible, without allowing it to dictate action unconditionally. Archaeological patterns suggest that early humans often lingered at declining sites before leaving fully. Occupation layers thin gradually. Use of resources tapers rather than stops abruptly. This gradual withdrawal aligns with the idea that emotional resistance slowed departure. Such friction prevented premature movement driven by short-term fluctuation. It allowed groups to confirm that change was necessary before committing fully. Emotional discomfort acted as a buffer against impulsivity. At the same time, this friction imposed cost. Remaining too long in deteriorating conditions could increase risk. The balance between holding on and letting go had to be negotiated repeatedly. Emotional systems did not provide clear answers. They provided weight. Decisions carried consequence because they felt consequential. This ensured that adaptation remained deliberate rather than reflexive. Importantly, loss sensitivity did not oppose adaptability. It shaped its tempo. Change occurred, but not without acknowledgement of what was being surrendered. This acknowledgement likely strengthened social cohesion. Shared loss could bind groups together during transition. Mourning a place or pattern collectively validated the difficulty of change. It allowed emotional alignment even as physical alignment shifted. In this way, feeling became part of coordination. The emotional weight of change also influenced how humans remembered the past. Places left behind acquired meaning beyond their immediate utility. They became reference points in collective memory. Stories about them carried caution, nostalgia, and instruction. Loss sharpened a recall. What was painful was remembered. This ensured that past environments were not erased from consideration, but held as potential futures under different conditions. Emotional attachment preserved optionality. Seen through this lens, adaptation was never a purely technical process. It was relational and affective. It involved recalibrating attachments as much as strategies. The mind registered loss to prevent reckless abandonment. It registered discomfort to slow irreversible decisions. Feeling was not noise, it was signal. This helps explain why change never felt neutral, even when it ensured survival. Neutral change would have been too easy to repeat without evaluation. Emotional cost imposed selectivity. It forced humans to weigh not only what could be gained, but what would be lost. Over time, this weighting refined adaptability into something sustainable rather than erratic. Change carried emotional weight because it mattered deeply. Adaptation came with a cost paid in feeling, and this emotional accounting reshaped how humans evaluated success itself. Survival was not measured only by continuation, but by continuity of meaning. A group might reach safer ground, yet feel diminished by what was left behind. This feeling was not irrational. It preserved a record of cost that purely outcome-based reasoning would erase. By carrying the emotional residue of loss forward, humans avoided treating adaptation as disposable. Each change left a trace, and those traces accumulated into judgment. Over time, this likely produced a cautious intelligence attuned not only to possibility, but to consequence. Decisions were not framed as simple exchanges. They were framed as trade-offs. Something would always be forfeited. Emotional discomfort ensured that forfeiture was acknowledged rather than abstracted away. In this way, feeling acted as a constraint on purely opportunistic behaviour. It limited how quickly and how often strategies could be abandoned without reflection. This constraint mattered because not all change was beneficial. Environments fluctuate on multiple timescales. Some shifts reverse. Others stabilize briefly before collapsing. An organism that treats every variation as a signal to move risks constant displacement and exhaustion. Loss sensitivity slowed reaction long enough for patterns to become legible. It allowed humans to distinguish transient disturbance from genuine transition. Emotional weight created temporal depth in decision-making. There is also reason to believe that this sensitivity to loss shaped social empathy. When everyone in a group felt the cost of leaving, decisions could be shared rather than imposed. Emotional resonance aligned perspectives. It reduced the likelihood that a single individual's optimism or desperation would dominate. Shared discomfort created common ground. This mattered in moments when agreement was fragile and stakes were high. Feeling together stabilized action together. The traces of this dynamic may be visible in later symbolic behaviors, though we should be cautious in drawing direct lines. The earliest indications of marking absence, returning to places no longer occupied, or preserving memory through gesture may reflect attempts to manage loss rather than deny it. Even before formal rituals of mourning appear, there is a sense that humans did not simply discard what they left. They carried it internally, integrating loss into identity rather than erasing it. This integration also protected against regret-driven paralysis. By allowing loss to be felt rather than avoided, humans reduced the need to undo decisions emotionally. The pain was processed collectively and gradually. This made forward movement possible without constant psychological reversal. Loss was acknowledged, not hidden. That acknowledgement allowed commitment to new conditions without denial of old ones. In this sense, emotional weight acted as a stabilizer across transitions. It anchored humans psychologically, while their environments shifted physically. The capacity to feel loss without being immobilized by it may have been one of the quiet achievements of human evolution. It permitted continuity of self and group across radical change. Identity did not dissolve every time circumstances did. As conditions continued to fluctuate, this emotional architecture deepened. Change remained difficult, but survivable. Each adaptation added to a reservoir of felt experience that informed future choices. The past was not just remembered, it was felt. This feeling refined intuition, sharpened caution, and preserved meaning across movement. Adaptation, then, was never cheap. It exacted an emotional toll precisely because it involved abandoning something real. But that toll was not wasted. It shaped judgment. It slowed excess. It bound groups together through shared cost. And it ensured that change, when undertaken, was taken seriously. Adaptation came with a cost paid in feeling. You look backward and see a horizon that appears calm, a time when life seems simpler, coherent, whole. A moment when everything you imagine finally made sense. Why do humans imagine a time when everything made sense? We do not know for certain when this longing for a stable past first emerged, but the archaeological record offers a quiet contradiction. When we excavate deeply enough, what we find is not equilibrium, but motion layered upon motion. Climate records derived from ice cores, lake sediments, and marine deposits show that the environments in which humans evolved were never still for long. Temperature, rainfall, vegetation, and coastlines shifted repeatedly across scales of decades, centuries, and millennia. Even during periods that appear relatively calm when averaged over long spans, variability persisted at human timescales. For those living within it, stability would have been fleeting rather than foundational. Archaeology reflects this instability with remarkable consistency. Cultural patterns emerge, persist briefly, and then dissolve or transform. Tool traditions that appear coherent within a narrow window fragment when traced across longer periods. Settlement patterns expand and contract. Subsistence strategies fluctuate. There is no prolonged archaeological horizon that suggests a golden age of balance. Instead, what we observe are short-lived equilibria, local alignments between people and place that held just long enough to be remembered before dissolving again. These moments of fit were real, but temporary. Paleoclimate data reinforces this picture. During the Middle and Late Pleistocene, climatic oscillations occurred frequently and sometimes abruptly. Wet phases alternated with arid ones. Forests expanded and retreated. Grasslands fragmented and reconnected. Coastlines advanced and withdrew. Human populations adjusted repeatedly, often within the span of a few generations. Even when conditions stabilized regionally, distant changes could ripple through ecosystems, altering migration routes, prey availability, or water access. Stability, in the sense of predictability across a lifetime, appears to have been rare, and yet, when humans remember the past, they often smooth it. Archaeological evidence shows repeated cycles of adjustment, but human memory tends to compress these cycles into narratives of coherence. Periods of relative success are remembered as if they were the norm rather than the exception. Failures fade, transitions blur. What remains is the impression of continuity. This is not deception. It is a cognitive tendency shaped by survival. Memory privileges what can be carried forward. It filters out constant disruption to preserve usable patterns. Cultural equilibria, when they occurred, were likely experienced as meaningful precisely because they were fragile. A season when rains arrived on time, a stretch of years when prey returned predictably, a route that remained passable longer than expected. These moments would have stood out against a backdrop of uncertainty. They were remembered, named, and later idealized. Over time, the memory of alignment could outgrow the reality of its brevity. What was once a short reprieve became a reference point for how things should be. Archaeology does not support the idea that early humans ever inhabited a long era of balance, from which they later fell. There is no clear stratigraphic line separating a stable beginning from a turbulent aftermath. Instead, turbulence is present from the start. The record shows continual recalibration. Even the emergence of new technologies or social structures did not eliminate variability. They shifted how humans responded to it. Change remained constant, even as strategies evolved. The idea of a stable origin appears instead to be a retrospective construction. Survivors tell stories. These stories help make sense of endurance. They create a narrative arc in which disruption follows order. This arc is comforting. It implies that stability is natural and loss is deviation. But the archaeological record suggests the opposite. Instability was the baseline. Order was temporary. The longing for a stable past may reflect not historical reality, but emotional need. This tendency to imagine a time when everything made sense may have served adaptive functions. It offered orientation. It provided a benchmark against which current conditions could be evaluated. By idealizing moments of alignment, humans preserved the idea that coherence was possible, even if rare. This belief could sustain effort during prolonged uncertainty. It could justify adaptation by framing it as a return rather than a departure. Memory transformed motion into narrative, yet this transformation came with cost. When the past is imagined as stable, the present feels deficient. Change feels like decline rather than continuity. This framing can obscure the fact that adjustment has always been the norm. It can make adaptation feel like failure rather than repetition of an ancient pattern. Archaeology challenges this perception. It shows that there was no long calm before the storm. There was only weather. The myth of the stable past also shapes how we interpret cultural remains. We tend to read coherence where there was improvisation. We draw boundaries around traditions that were likely porous. We describe phases as if they were states rather than processes. This is understandable. Static categories are easier to grasp than constant flux, but they risk misrepresenting the lived experience of early humans, whose lives unfolded within shifting constraints rather than settled systems. When we align archaeological evidence with paleoclimate data, a different picture emerges. Human history appears less like a departure from stability and more like a continuous negotiation with change. Success was measured not by permanence, but by responsiveness. Cultural forms that endured did so because they could flex, not because they were fixed. What we interpret as stability may have been nothing more than a brief alignment between expectation and reality. This realization reframes nostalgia itself. Longing for a stable past may not be a desire to return to something that once existed. It may be a desire to escape the emotional labor of constant adjustment. Early humans carried this labor as well. They adapted repeatedly, but they also remembered moments when adaptation felt unnecessary. Those moments gained symbolic weight. Over time, memory elevated them into imagined eras. Archaeology, however, refuses to confirm such eras. It offers instead a record of persistence without pause. Layer after layer reveals change nested within change. No horizon announces arrival at equilibrium. No phase promises rest. The ground keeps shifting, even when movement slows. The idea of a stable origin, then, is not preserved in the soil. It is preserved in the stories told by those who survived, long enough to tell them. Memory smooths what reality never did. This smoothing of memory did not occur accidentally. It was shaped by the same cognitive systems that allowed humans to function under uncertainty. Brains that constantly recalculated every disruption as entirely new would struggle to act at all. Some degree of narrative compression was necessary. By organizing past experience into recognizable patterns, humans could make decisions without re-evaluating every variable from the beginning. Memory became selective not to distort reality, but to make it usable. Over time, this selectivity produced a subtle inversion. Instead of seeing adaptation as the norm punctuated by moments of calm, humans began to remember calm as the norm interrupted by disruption. The record does not support this inversion, but the mind does. It is easier to orient oneself around imagined baselines than around perpetual flux. A remembered stillness offers contrast. It gives change an emotional shape. Without it, motion would feel endless and unbounded. This is why archaeological interpretation itself is vulnerable to the same illusion. Researchers, like the people they study, seek coherence. We group artifacts into cultures, we assign phases, we draw timelines that imply progression from one state to another. These tools are necessary, but they can quietly imply stability where there was none. When viewed closely, many so-called cultural periods dissolve into overlapping practices, regional variations and constant modification. The categories hold because we hold them, not because the past conformed neatly to them. The myth of a stable past also influences how humans imagine origins. Origins are often portrayed as moments of clarity, when systems first formed and meaning crystallized. But the evidence suggests something messier. Early technologies emerged unevenly. Social arrangements shifted gradually and sometimes reversed. Even biological traits associated with modern humans appeared in mosaics rather than packages. There was no moment when everything clicked. There were only sequences of partial solutions. Recognizing this does not diminish the past. It restores its texture. It allows us to see early humans not as inhabitants of a lost balance, but as constant negotiators. Their achievements were not the creation of stability, but the ability to function without it. The absence of equilibrium did not paralyze them, it trained them. Over generations, this training shaped expectations. The world was not assumed to be steady, it was assumed to be workable, temporarily. This reframing also alters how we understand continuity. Continuity did not depend on sameness of environment or culture. It depended on the ability to reconfigure relationships under new conditions. Groups persisted because they adjusted, not because they remained unchanged. What survived was not a state of being, but a process of response. Memory, when it later idealized certain moments, obscured this process behind imagined stillness. The persistence of the stable past myth suggests it continues to serve a function. It provides psychological rest. It offers a sense of origin that feels anchored rather than provisional. In times of uncertainty, humans reach for narratives that imply lost order. These narratives are not evidence of decline. They are evidence of the mind-seeking orientation. But archaeology invites a gentler correction. It shows that there was no long peace before the noise. There was only navigation. Understanding this does not require abandoning meaning. It requires relocating it. Meaning was not generated by stability, but by engagement with change. Early humans didn't wait for conditions to settle before acting. They acted while conditions shifted. Their stories, later smoothed by memory, preserved fragments of alignment, but lost sight of constant motion beneath them. When we listen carefully to the archaeological record, the illusion loosens. The past stops appearing as a place where everything made sense. It becomes a sequence of negotiations, each incomplete, each temporary. What endures is not a stable foundation, but a capacity to move forward without one. Memory smooths what reality never did. A small group adjusts its path without discussion. No marker is left behind, no object is buried, no words are spoken that we can recover. They move because the water is no longer where it was. They hunt something different because the old prey no longer comes. Nothing announces that a change has occurred, and yet everything has changed. What if, for most of human history, adaptation happened without ceremony, without meaning attached, without a story to hold it in place? Archaeology confronts us with this silence again and again. In the deepest layers of the human record, change rarely announces itself through ritual or symbol. Camps shift. Tool forms alter slightly. Diets widen or narrow. Movement patterns bend and then straighten again. But there are no clear thresholds, no formal transitions, no evidence of communal acknowledgement that something old has ended and something new has begun. We do not find graves marking the death of a way of life. We do not find structures built to commemorate transformation. What we find instead is behaviour, quiet, pragmatic, unadorned. The evidence suggests that for much of the Paleolithic, humans adapted first and only much later learned to explain what they had done. In early archaeological contexts across Africa and Eurasia, changes appear as adjustments rather than revolutions. A campsite used for a short span is abandoned, then another appears elsewhere. Stone tools vary subtly in form and raw material, not because a new identity has emerged, but because the nearest stone is different. Faunal remains show shifting prey preferences that align closely with environmental availability rather than cultural choice. There is no clear signal that these changes were framed as meaningful events. They look less like decisions about who to be and more like answers to immediate questions of survival. What works now? What does not? Where to go next? We do not know for certain how early humans understood these moments internally, but the absence of material markers suggests that change itself was not yet an object of reflection. There is little evidence of formal transition markers in the early record. No consistent initiation artifacts, no symbolic thresholds, no durable signs that adaptation required acknowledgement beyond its practical execution. This does not mean early humans lacked inner lives or emotional depth. It means that meaning, as something externalized and preserved, had not yet become necessary for survival. Change did not need to be explained. It only needed to function. In this context, adaptation appears as necessity rather than identity. People did not become something else when circumstances shifted. They simply did something else. The distinction matters. Identity implies continuity and contrast. A sense of before and after that can be named. But in much of prehistory, there is no clear before and after. There is only variation. A tool used here but not there. A resource exploited this season but ignored the next. The archaeological record shows flexibility without narrative. Behaviour leads. Meaning follows, if it follows at all. This pattern challenges modern assumptions about change. Today, transformation is often framed through explanation, justification, and self-understanding. We narrate change as a passage, a break, a reinvention. But the deep past suggests a different order. Humans adapted long before they described adaptation. They altered behaviour without attaching symbolic weight to the act. Survival decisions were not framed as statements about the self or the group. They were responses to conditions that demanded no interpretation beyond their outcome. The absence of ceremony does not indicate a lack of complexity. It indicates a different allocation of cognitive and social resources. In unstable environments, energy spent explaining change may have offered little advantage. What mattered was responsiveness, speed, the ability to alter course without hesitation. Ritual, as far as we can tell, emerges later, when conditions allow for reflection, repetition, and social consolidation. Only when humans began to occupy landscapes more persistently do we see the gradual appearance of symbolic markers tied to transition. Only then does change become something that must be acknowledged, remembered, and shared. This suggests that meaning is not a prerequisite for adaptation, it is a consequence of it. As humans became more settled, more socially layered, more invested in continuity, the need to explain change increased. Loss required commemoration, transition required framing, identity required reinforcement. But before this shift, adaptation unfolded without explanation. It left behind no story, only altered patterns of movement and use. The ground doesn't remember why people left. It only records that they did. Seen this way, much of human history unfolds without ceremony. Change is not marked by endings. It is not paused for acknowledgement. It happens while attention is elsewhere, while hunger presses, while weather shifts, while opportunity opens and closes. The archaeological record preserves this indifference. It shows us that for most of our past, change did not yet carry a name. It didn't require justification. It did not ask permission. Only later, when humans began to stay longer in one place, to invest more deeply in continuity, did change become something that needed explanation. Only then did rituals emerge to soften the disruption, to make sense of loss, to bind communities through shared narratives of transformation. But that world had not yet arrived. For hundreds of thousands of years, adaptation occurred without ceremony, before identity, before myth, before meaning hardened into form. In the deep past, change arrived quietly and left quietly. It did not announce itself. It didn't ask to be understood. It simply reshaped behaviour and moved on. And only much later would humans begin to give change a name. As this pattern repeats across the archaeological record, another quiet implication begins to surface. When change leaves no trace of ceremony, it also leaves no clear boundary for memory to anchor itself to. Without markers, without objects set aside to signify transition, adaptation slips past awareness. It becomes difficult to say when one way of living ended and another began. The ground preserves sequences, but the people moving across it may not have experienced those sequences as distinct chapters. What we read as transitions may have been felt as continuity under pressure, life adjusting without pause. This helps explain why so much of early human history feels blurred rather than segmented. The absence of ritual does not merely reflect a lack of symbolic capacity. It reflects a world in which time itself was not yet divided into eras of meaning. Seasonal cycles returned, but they did not accumulate into narratives of progress or decline. Movement followed opportunity, not chronology. Decisions were local and immediate. A group did not need to remember why it changed last year if the same conditions might never return. Memory was practical, not commemorative. Archaeological sequences show this again and again. Tool traditions fade without replacement ceremonies. Subsistence strategies shift without visible mourning. Camps dissolve without closure. There is no sense that something must be honoured before it is left behind. This does not mean early humans were indifferent to loss. It means that loss was integrated into life rather than set apart from it. When a resource disappeared, attention turned elsewhere. When a place no longer worked, it was not framed as abandonment, but as movement. The language of loss had not yet solidified. We can see this most clearly in how little effort was invested in preserving the past materially. Objects were not accumulated for remembrance. Places were not monumentalized. Knowledge moved with people, but it moved lightly. What mattered was not what had been, but what could still be used. This economy of attention favoured responsiveness over reflection. Meaning, in the sense of explanation, may have been a luxury that early conditions didn't reward. Only later, as environments allowed longer occupation and social complexity increased, did humans begin to slow change down enough to notice it. Only then did adaptation begin to fracture into before and after. Ceremony emerges not because humans suddenly felt the need to change, but because they finally had the conditions to recognize that they already had. Ritual does not create transition. It marks it, often long after the fact. This perspective reframes how we think about the relationship between survival and meaning. It suggests that explanation is not the engine of adaptation, but its echo. Humans did not first decide who they were and then change accordingly. They changed, and only later asked what that change meant. Identity followed behaviour, not the other way around. The deep past shows us a species capable of profound flexibility without self-description, able to move through instability without stopping to narrate itself. In that sense, the silence of early change is not emptiness, it is efficiency. A world that demanded constant adjustment left little room for ceremony and no requirement for closure. Adaptation happened before reflection could catch up. Meaning would arrive eventually, shaped by settlement, memory, and the accumulation of loss. But for most of our history, humans lived inside change without naming it. Only later would humans begin to give change a name. Imagine this for a moment. A species that spent hundreds of thousands of years in motion begins very slowly to imagine what it would mean to stop. Not because the world finally became safe, but because the idea of safety itself had taken root. What if the longing for permanence arrived not as a biological inheritance, but as a late and uneasy dream layered on top of a far older design? We do not know for certain when humans first began to desire stillness, but the archaeological record suggests that it was not an early instinct. For most of human existence, movement was not a strategy chosen among others. It was the default condition of survival. Camps appeared and vanished. Routes shifted. Landscapes were read like weather, not owned like territory. When conditions improved, humans did not immediately settle. When resources stabilized, they often continued to move. This hesitation matters. It suggests that sedentism was not an obvious or inevitable goal, even when it became possible. The first signs of longer occupation appear unevenly and tentatively. Sites show repeated returns, seasonal clustering, longer stays, but rarely an abrupt decision to remain forever. Even in regions where climates became more predictable toward the end of the Pleistocene, mobility persisted. Groups lingered longer, but they did not stop entirely. They tested stillness the way one tests thin ice, carefully, reversibly, always ready to retreat. The ground may have offered the possibility of permanence, but bodies shaped by motion did not rush to accept it. This resistance to full settlement cannot be explained by environment alone. In many cases, ecological conditions were sufficiently stable to support longer habitation. Yet people continued to move. Archaeologists find evidence of maintained routes, seasonal dispersals, and repeated circulation between known places. This pattern suggests an internal constraint as much as an external one. Humans were capable of staying, but not yet convinced that staying was wise. Here, the tension between biology and desire begins to surface. A brain shaped by unpredictability learns to associate survival with flexibility. Predictability, while attractive, carries its own risks. Staying in one place concentrates dependency. It ties survival to specific resources, specific cycles, specific failures. For a species whose past was defined by abrupt change, such commitment may have felt dangerous, even when conditions improved. The mind learned caution before it learned comfort. At the same time, the archaeological record hints at a growing psychological attraction to regularity. Longer occupations leave traces of repeated routines, hearths reused, spaces organized, the beginnings of spatial memory that extends beyond immediate need. These are small shifts, but they point toward a new desire emerging alongside old habits. The wish to know what tomorrow will look like, the appeal of returning to the same place and finding it unchanged. This longing did not replace mobility, it layered itself on top of it. Humans did not stop moving because they wanted rest. They began to imagine rest because movement had become so deeply embedded. After generations of adjustment, the idea of predictability acquired emotional weight, not as something inherited, but as something earned. Rest became aspirational precisely because it had never been guaranteed. We can see this most clearly in how early sedentary experiments often coexist with continued mobility. Even as some groups began to invest more heavily in particular places, they retained the knowledge and pathways required to leave. Tools, subsistence strategies, and social networks remained adaptable. There is no clean break. Instead, there is hesitation. A foot, placed on still ground while the other remains ready to step away. This pattern challenges the assumption that humans naturally seek permanence. The record suggests something subtler. Humans learned to survive through motion long before they learned to desire rest. When the desire emerged, it didn't erase the older skill. It competed with it. The attraction to predictability grew within a body and mind still calibrated for change. This internal contradiction has consequences. It means that even when humans begin to settle, they carry with them a nervous system attuned to instability. The longing for stillness does not erase the memory of movement. It exists alongside it, creating tension, a desire for rootedness paired with an inherited sensitivity to risk. This may help explain why early sedentary lifeways appear fragile, reversible, and unevenly adopted. Rest, in this light, is not a return to something ancient. It is a new ambition, a hope shaped by experience rather than instinct. The archaeological record does not show humans rushing toward permanence as soon as they could. It shows them circling it, testing it, pulling back, and trying again. Stillness had to be learned, and it arrived late. What emerges from this is not a story of progress towards settlement, but a story of negotiation, between bodies built for motion and minds beginning to crave predictability, between biological inheritance and emerging desire. Humans did not abandon movement because it stopped working. They experimented with rest because they had survived long enough to imagine it. The wish for stillness arrived after the skill of motion. As this negotiation unfolded, another quiet shift began to take shape beneath the surface of daily life. When humans lingered longer in one place, even briefly, their attention changed. Movement sharpens perception outward, scanning horizons and reading signs of absence and approach. Lingering redirects attention inward, toward arrangement, repetition, and anticipation. The difference is subtle, but consequential. A mobile life asks where to go next. A semi-stationary one begins to ask what can be maintained. Archaeological traces suggest that this change in attention did not immediately produce security. Longer stays often coincided with new forms of anxiety. Evidence of storage appears sporadically, not as a confident innovation but as an experiment. Stored food solves one problem while creating another. It invites protection, planning, and defense. It binds survival to foresight rather than responsiveness. For a species accustomed to adjusting in real time, this represented a different cognitive load. The future became heavier, the present less forgiving. We do not see early humans celebrating permanence when it first appears. Instead, we see caution. Settlements remain shallow. Architectural investment is minimal. Materials are easy to abandon. Even when people return to the same locations repeatedly, they avoided entrenchment. This suggests an unresolved tension. Stillness promised relief from constant recalibration, but it also demanded trust in conditions remaining favourable. That trust had not yet been earned. The psychological appeal of predictability may have grown precisely because unpredictability had been endured for so long. After generations of responding to environmental fluctuation, the idea of regularity carried emotional resonance. Knowing where water would be tomorrow, knowing which plants would be there next season, knowing that shelter would not have to be rebuilt each time. These are small comforts, but they accumulate. They begin to feel like rest. Yet rest, once imagined, is never neutral. To desire it is to notice its absence. The archaeological record suggests that as humans began to value predictability, they also became more sensitive to its disruption. Longer occupations leave behind more traces of stress when conditions shifted. Sudden abandonment of semi-settled sites often appears abrupt, suggesting that the loss of expected stability carried weight. What had once been routine movement now felt like interruption. This may mark the beginning of a new relationship with change, not one defined solely by necessity, but by disappointment. When mobility is assumed, movement carries little emotional charge. When stillness is hoped for, movement becomes loss. The longing for rest reframes adaptation as sacrifice. Change begins to hurt in a different way. It is important to note that this pain does not signal weakness. It signals investment. To want permanence is to imagine continuity beyond the immediate moment. It reflects a mind beginning to stretch further into the future, to hold expectations rather than possibilities. This cognitive shift would eventually allow for complex social structures, long-term planning, and symbolic meaning. But at this stage, it remained fragile. The archaeological hesitation around sedentism tells us something essential about human nature. We were not pulled toward permanence by instinct. We edged toward it cautiously, burdened by memories of environments that had turned without warning. Our bodies knew how to move, our minds were learning how to hope for stillness. That hope did not erase motion, it complicated it. Even today, traces of this tension remain. We build structures meant to last, yet feel restless within them. We seek stability, yet respond viscerally when it begins to feel confining. The deep past reminds us that this contradiction is not a flaw, it is a legacy. Humans learned to adapt long before they learned to stay, a record of humanity written not in monuments or finished forms, but in what is missing, in the spaces between occupations, in the layers that never quite settle, in the places where people pass through and did not stay. What if the most faithful archive of our past is not what remains standing, but what was repeatedly left behind? When archaeologists excavate deep time, they do not find arrival points. They find sequences of use and abandonment, Thin horizons of activity separated by silence, hearths without successors, tools without descendants, camps that appear once and never again. The record does not move toward a final arrangement. It fans outward, interrupted, uneven, and unresolved. We do not see humanity arriving at a stable form. We see it continually reshaping itself in response to conditions that refuse to stabilize. This is one of the most consistent patterns across prehistoric archaeology. Meaning is carried not only by what is present, but by what is absent. Gaps in occupation are not failures of preservation. They are signals. They tell us that people left, that movement occurred, that a place no longer fit the requirements of survival. In many cases, these absences are the clearest evidence we have of decision-making. A site that is never returned to speaks as loudly as one that is reused. Change is written into the ground through discontinuity. Layers of sediment accumulate over time, but human presence does not follow a smooth progression. Instead, it pulses. Occupation, abandonment, return, departure again. This rhythm repeats across continents and climates. It suggests that adaptation did not resolve uncertainty. It managed it temporarily before moving on. Survival was not achieved by reaching equilibrium, but by avoiding stagnation. The archaeological record does not preserve a finished humanity because none ever existed. We do not find a moment when humans became fully adapted. There is no layer that marks the end of adjustment. Instead, adaptability itself appears as an unfinished inheritance. Each generation received a body and mind shaped by previous instability, then faced new conditions that required further revision. What was learned was not a single way of living, but how to abandon ways of living that no longer worked. Survival was written in departures more often than in arrivals. This perspective reframes how we interpret continuity. Traditions persist, but they do so unevenly. Technologies reappear, not because they were perfected, but because they remained useful under recurring pressures. Cultural patterns echo across time, but never exactly repeat. There is no final template of behaviour passed forward intact. Instead, there is a recurring willingness to discard, adapt, and move on. Change is not a disruption to the story. It is the story. From this vantage point, the idea of a stable human nature becomes difficult to sustain. What we see instead is a lineage defined by responsiveness. Not endlessly flexible in every direction, but capable of loosening its grip when circumstances demanded it. The past does not show us who humans were meant to be. It shows us what they were willing to give up. This has implications beyond prehistory. It suggests that the discomfort we associate with change is not evidence that something has gone wrong. It is evidence that something ancient is still operating. The pull toward familiarity exists alongside an inherited capacity to leave it behind. Neither impulse is complete on its own. Together they form a system that has carried humans through repeated instability. When we look back through the archaeological record, we do not see a march toward rest. We see motion punctuated by brief experiments in staying. We see adaptation layered on adaptation, without closure. There is no final form of being human preserved in stone or soil. Only traces of adjustment, recalibration, and movement onward. What remains, then, is not an origin to return to, but a pattern to recognize. Humanity did not emerge into a stable world and then lose it. It emerged within change and learned gradually how not to be broken by it. The ground shifted, the climate turned, resources vanished, and again, people left, carrying forward only what could move. Change was never a phase. It was the shape of the journey itself, and long before humans asked who they were, they learned how not to remain. As the excavation deepens, another quiet pattern becomes visible. The farther back we look, the less the past resembles a foundation, and the more it resembles a series of departures layered upon one another. What survives is not a blueprint, but a method, not a destination, but a way of moving through uncertainty without expecting it to end. This may be the most enduring legacy left behind by early humans. Not tools, not camps, not even stories, but a tolerance for unfinishedness. Archaeological layers rarely resolve cleanly. They blur at the edges, overlap, fade. Even the most carefully studied sequences resist neat interpretation. This is not a failure of evidence. It is a reflection of lives lived without finality. Adaptation did not aim to complete something. It aimed to remain possible. The absence of closure in the record mirrors the absence of closure in experience. People did not live waiting for stability to arrive. They lived within flux, adjusting just enough to continue. This helps explain why the idea of an endpoint feels so compelling and so elusive. Humans are not the descendants of those who found balance and stayed there. They are the descendants of those who moved on before imbalance became fatal. What was selected over time was not comfort with chaos, but competence within it, a capacity to respond without needing resolution, a willingness to treat survival as provisional rather than permanent. Seen this way, adaptability is not a trait that can be completed or perfected. It is a process that never closes. Each solution creates the conditions for new problems. Each adjustment reshapes the landscape of risk. There is no final version of human behaviour waiting to be uncovered beneath the sediment. Only iterations, each shaped by pressures that no longer exist, each incomplete in its own time. This perspective also reframes how we think about inheritance. What is passed down is not a stable identity, but a readiness to revise identity. Not a fixed relationship to place, but a practiced ability to detach from it. The archaeological record shows humans repeatedly choosing to leave behind what once sustained them, without knowing exactly what would replace it. That choice, repeated across generations, shaped a lineage comfortable with contingency. The gaps in the record matter because they reveal restraint as much as action. Leaving requires restraint. It requires recognizing when persistence becomes liability. This is not recklessness. It is discernment forged under pressure. The decision to abandon a place, a strategy, or a pattern of a living leaves little material trace, yet it echoes through survival itself. Absence becomes evidence. Over time, humans would begin to tell stories about origins, golden ages, and lost stability. These narratives smooth the past, giving it coherence that lived experience may never have had. Archaeology resists this smoothing. It preserves friction. It shows us a past that never fully settled, never resolved into certainty. A past where movement was not failure but continuity. If there is a lesson embedded here, it is not instructional in the modern sense. It does not tell us what to change or how to change it. It reminds us that change was not introduced into human life by modernity. It was present from the beginning, shaping bodies, minds, and social forms long before explanation or meaning were attached to it. What change left behind is not a map of where to go, but a record of how to leave without disappearing, a lineage that endured by refusing to become fixed, a history written less in permanence than in passage. And long before humans asked who they were, they learned how not to remain.